I didn't really start using the transgender umbrella term for myself until I was probably in my 20s. I never thought that I could even have the jobs that I have today and that I could have a job in the professional world, because I never saw anyone like me in the professional world.
What's the relevance of pride, and what's the relevance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? To begin with, what is that, and is that something that should be embraced?
The way I try to describe DEIB, it's a lot of words, but at its core, DEIB is really just about, you might be surprised by my answer. The biggest challenge that I face in this work is I don't care what technology you have, there's somebody behind something pressing a button, right? People are customers. People are our families. People are our communities. So in the end, the most important thing is enabling people. A meaningful life for me is really, I have to say, I love the boring days, Joseph. The boring days are the best.
Welcome to Meaningful. Marketing, mentoring, mattering. With me, Joseph Alcantara. Together, we'll uncover the power of purpose, experience mentorship magic, unpack ways to make a difference, and find transformative journeys as a community. Welcome to Meaningful. Marketing, mentoring, mattering. With me, Joseph Alcantara. This month, we're celebrating Pride and honoring the LGBTQ+ community's profound impact on society. Join us as we explore stories of courage, authenticity, trailblazing contributions, and how the community's involvement shapes a more inclusive world. But before we dive in, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you're updated every time we have a new episode. Today, we have an exceptional guest with us, someone whose work in the field of education, diversity, equity, and inclusion has left a remarkable impact on global organizations. Please join me in welcoming Kristy Lilas. Kristy has been dedicated to a career of driving change through education, believing firmly in the power of learning, not just from what's on a page, but from each other and the world around us. Kristy's journey has included various roles in strategy and operations at global education companies, leading teams in designing and executing cross-functional organizational process and technology transformations. Currently, Kristy serves as the head of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging at GoDaddy. Here, Kristy develops and executes the global DEIB vision and strategy, and integrating these priorities into day-to-day business processes. Before GoDaddy, as the Senior Director of Inclusion and Diversity at Cengage, Kristy developed a holistic cross-functional program focused on inclusion and diversity across business operations, employee experience, and customer experience globally. Please welcome to the pod, Kristy Lilas. Hi, Kristy.
Hello, Joseph. How are you?
I'm good. I miss you so much. Let me just put it out there. But it's great to have you. And thank you so much for saying yes to the invitation. I'm very excited for the conversation that we're about to have this afternoon.
No, I so appreciate you inviting me. I mean, I've been watching this podcast grow and grow, and you're doing amazing work. And I was just so humbled when you asked me. And then that was way too kind of an introduction, but I appreciate it. And I'm excited to catch up with you and chat.
All right, so let's dive right in. I asked my guest the same first question. I'm going to ask you the same first question, and that is, what is your meaningful life story in your own words? Take us back to your origin story, your background, and your life experience that led you to where you are today, please.
Okay. I thank you for asking. I'll try to not bore everyone with my story, because my story is no more important than anyone else's, but I appreciate the question too. I don't think it's a question that most of us are necessarily used to answering, but perhaps it's one that we should all think about for ourselves, especially that meaningful part. I'd say, of course, our stories start with the people who come before us. So I'd be remiss to not tell you a little bit about my father and my mother, if you're willing. But my father's family was from Greece and didn't have much. They grew up with no electricity, no running water, and no food security at the time. And they got displaced during World War II. And over the years, many of my father's siblings didn't survive that time. But later, my father stayed in the US when he visited as part of the Greek Navy. He decided to jump ship and hang out in New York. And he met my mother working at a Greek owned diner in Brooklyn. And for those who are familiar with, Greek owned diners in New York, they're usually pretty lovely. They didn't speak the same language, but that didn't stop them from getting married. And then my mother's family also really grew up in poverty, so much so that at one point my mother and her siblings spent some time in an orphanage, actually. They got reunited back with my grandmother after a while, who later, did everything she could to provide for them, no matter what life threw at them, right? But their stories of life in Brooklyn are admittedly like really kind of difficult to hear. Suffice to say, these stories, had a big influence on mine, like everybody's stories do. And I'd say generational trauma, resilience, and grit kind of were all passed down to me through those stories and through those experiences. And like many, if not most folks, I think, or I suspect who are listening in, I had a bit of a chaotic childhood with both moments of love and joy, but also sadness and uncertainty. To overcome that uncertainty, I started working from a very young age to do everything I could to kind of build a path to some sense of security, including my physical, financial, and emotional security. It's kind of something that I don't know that we always think about as kids, is how we are building security in our future. But that was a hyper focus for me. I also started realizing at a young age how people were treated differently because of who they are. And I had and continue to have a very, I'd say, inflated sense of fairness and justice. Respect is the most important thing to me. And a turning point for me was when I was 10, and my mother brought me to see the movie Schindler's List that was just released. I was the youngest kid in the theater. My mom totally got looks for that. People were definitely judging her for having me there. But she brought me, she felt it was important that I see and understand like how injustices can show up and exist in the world. And coming out of that movie, I was so moved by what I saw, and connecting it to the other things that I saw in my world, right? Like how the Black folks in my very white community were being treated, and how people with disabilities were being treated, right? And I knew I had to act my part in our society in terms of holding each other accountable for how we treat each other. So, and then combine that with later having to maneuver my own identity and what it meant for me and how I was treated too. And my brother very courageously came out before me. I came out soon after at like 12 or 13. I didn't really start using the transgender umbrella term for myself until I was probably in my 20s. And I think that's in part because identity is a funny thing in that I don't really know how we would define ourselves if it wasn't for how people reacted to us, right? So I often consider like, how would I view myself if I wasn't influenced by the society around me and like the society's perspectives of me? I really have no idea. So I get caught in a loop on that when I think about identity. Anyway, it was for all those reasons that I felt compelled to find work that not only provided a means of income, but also provided something meaningful in our society. And then I'll just finish off with in my personal life, I never really, I struggled to feel accepted for who I was until I met my wife, Rebecca. So you've met her, Joseph.
Yeah.
So I knew she was the one for me because of that, right? Because of that feeling of acceptance from her. And she and I have been together for over 18 years now. And over that time, it's been interesting to see each other. Like we're growing as a couple together, but we've also helped each other grow as individuals because it's been, so long, and we got together relatively young. And now we live outside of Boston with our lovely and silly pets and my mother-in-law. So that's some of my story.
Wow, Kristy. I mean, if someone listens to your story who is probably in that cusp of trying to understand and figure out their situation in the world, especially those younger folks in the LGBTQ plus community who haven't felt that full acceptance yet, whether from their family, their friends, or their circle, and also the intersectionality of, say, for example, immigrant families or people from the low income sector, they would probably think that, Kristy, your story is just like one in a million. It's something that, is so far fetched for me to eventually have. But I'm sure that when you were in that situation as well, I'm just second guessing that the way you've narrated your story today, which is like literally for me, rainbows and unicorns, like literally hearing it. I'm sure that there were challenges along the way that eventually helped you build this foundation of respect, hope, getting to know yourself, your true identity, and then eventually meeting your lovely wife and thriving where you are right now, how did you navigate that journey and that path? And if there are folks, I'm sure that there are folks listening to us today who are on the opposite side of where we are today, how do we empower them and make them feel that hopefully it'll get there eventually in their situation as well?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and to be honest, like, this is why representation matters so much, right? So, one of the reasons why I never thought that I could even have the jobs that I have today, and that I could have a job in the professional world, is I never saw anyone like me in the professional world, right? I didn't think it was going to be possible. So to that point, like, thank you for amplifying these stories to kind of show that anything really is possible, or at least most things are possible. And I don't know if this is going to make folks feel better or worse, I have to say, but it is a journey. It's never over, right? Like, it's not like I hit this point and I'm like, oh, yep, there's no more challenges, there's no more sadness, there are no more barriers to overcome. That's not how life works, right? But what I did do was leverage the difficulties as much as I could to build a resiliency and to build a persistence that I have to tap into all the time, and I still do. And I still don't know who I am. I mean, I just talked about, like, what does identity even mean? I have no idea who I really am, and it changes often. And I think our sense of self should be fluid. We are, that is part of our humanity. But the constraints of our society mean that we feel like we have to categorize ourselves and put ourselves in these buckets. And that's true not just of sexual orientation and gender identity, right? But like ability and just personality types and race and ethnicity and all these different intersectional experiences of ours. We create these buckets that we put ourselves in that are so limiting. So what I've tried to do over the course of my life is understand why I need to use those buckets, but not letting it define me for me internally, right? Like, I'll use those categories as needed to kind of do that shorthand and communicating more about myself to my society. But I'm not going to let that constrain who I feel like I am, especially my core values, right? And my core ethics. So I think, my general suggestion for folks who are just feeling through it right now is just know that never ends. So, like, you're doing fine now and you're going to keep doing fine. And like, the best that we can do is just find as much joy and happiness as we can amidst the general chaos of life. Right. So keep it up. Right. And then B, like, try not to constrain yourself by allowing all of these external pressures to really change your journey, because your journey is your own. And, you're always going to find more happiness by just being like, I'm going to do what I can for me. And I'm going to do it in a way that's kind to others, right? But prioritizes my experience and my safety and happiness in the day-to-day.
That is super inspiring, Kristy, and very authentic and realistic as well, because we are not overpromising. We're not telling everyone that, hey, once you hit this, you're done and you're going to be forever happy. It's a continuum. We will continue to explore and have our own journeys. It's not a point A to point B situation, which I think everyone should hopefully embrace and understand, because, phases, stages, and seasons in life actually really matter. I've mentioned earlier about us celebrating the Pride Month. By the way, happy Pride. I should have greeted you happy Pride. First of all, happy Pride to us. I just would want to ask you, well, two things. I'll combo it, because Pride Month is something that's continuously being celebrated. But there are folks starting to ask, is it relevant? Should we continue to celebrate that? What is that? What is its meaning? And second, with your professional life in terms of what you're doing right now, which is DEIB work. If folks are asking that question, what's the relevance of pride and what's the relevance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? To begin with, what is that? And is that something that should be embraced by companies? Folks will probably say, especially the entrepreneurs we're in, I'm just here to create my company and to bring my business and, have that come to fruition.
Well, let me start with the broader. So I'll start with the DEIB question and then kind of get into pride, because I think it's really important that we talk about this, especially as, we continue to work on our journey toward equal rights and equity across the board. The way I try to describe DEIB, it's a lot of words, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Those words mean all different kinds of things to different people. But at its core, I try to focus people on its simplicity, especially in the workplace. DEIB is really just about how we work together and how we feel about ourselves. That simple, right? It's about our relationships. It's about how effective we are in working together, and it's about how our relationships make ourselves, feel the way we feel about ourselves. It's really that simple. And it can be that broad too. But I think the beauty of DEIB is that we can then apply it in specific and tactical ways as needed, and just in time for moments that require, I guess, an extra lens on it, for example. And I think Pride Month gives us that, right? And for those who aren't in or close to the community, it might be hard to understand. Like, why are we so moved by celebrating something so private like our sexual orientation, right? Like, why are we talking about it, let alone like waving flags and cheering for it? I totally understand that question. And of course, I can't speak for all members of our community, but for me, I'll share that Pride Month helps me feel seen, heard, and very importantly, believed. The battles and the challenges that I've lived through because of my gender and sexual orientation don't have to be understood by everyone around me. But pride and all that comes with it is more of a symbol of acknowledgement, right? It's I don't have to understand, but I acknowledge. And that acknowledgement alone helps me feel respected, considered, and included right off the bat. Pride is also, I think, a reminder of the battles that those before us have fought for equal rights, some of whom have lost their lives over it and gave up their lives in so many ways and suffered through being closeted or mistreatment their entire lives for that progress. I think it's a reminder of the significant progress we have made. And then, of course, the continued challenges that we face, right? It helps me understand my privilege, too, I will say, having been born in a place where I may face discrimination and harassment, but like the government isn't actively trying to purge me and my people right now where I live, right? And that's a privilege. And then, so that's kind of the community perspective. And then for allies, and I think for different groups within our community, Pride is a moment that kind of pushes all of us to education and action, right? It's a moment that allows us to reflect on the many different experiences that exist around identity, whether it's our identity or someone else's. And I think it's a helpful moment to understand that, because whether someone else's experience resonates with you or not, their experience is their story, it's their fact, and it's their history, which, because we exist in a society, right, becomes all of our shared stories, our shared facts, and our shared histories. So I find, Heritage Months and Spotlight Months like Pride to be really important for all of that. And that's kind of how I try to structure it and leverage it in the workplace when we talk about it in a DEIB perspective.
That's great. And that's very enlightening, especially for folks not close to, I would say, the concepts of both, but diving deeper into both in the workplace setting. Well, two questions. One would be, what are the challenges that, folks within the community who are working, or either part of the LGBTQ plus community or in general, when it comes to the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion? What are the challenges that each of us face and what organizations are facing? And then second, the positive side to it is that if you will be challenging companies in terms of how to meaningfully celebrate Pride, the Pride Month, what should they be doing?
Yeah, it's a great dual part question. So I'll start with the challenges, right? So honestly, I think the challenges around LGBTQA plus topics are pretty consistent with like the general challenges that we face around DEIB more broadly, right? And that's because, again, at its core, this work is really just about creating enough curiosity, compassion, and courage and empathy for people to really understand how to set each other up for success and how to engage inclusively and equitably with each other. You might be surprised by my answer. It might not be one that you suspect. The biggest challenge that I face in this work is time. And when I say time, I don't mean mine, although that's true too, but everyone else's, right? Because companies and organizations need to allow a certain amount of space and time for people to get engaged and to be thoughtful in how they're interacting with one another, and to get to know each other enough to understand each other's needs, right? Like, these are the best practices that we talk about is, be curious, learn about what somebody needs in order to support them. That's how you be an ally. That takes time, right? Instead, especially in the corporate world, we move so fast. And it's just go, 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 right? How on earth do we expect people to engage with each other well when we're not giving them literally the time, space, and encouragement to do so, right? And actually, take the example of Pride Month. I'm sure we all have a lot of colleagues who don't quite understand the meaning and purpose of the month for our community. So, we might host a workshop or a conversation or put out some communications about it to enable that learning. But if people literally do not have the time to engage with any of that, it's totally useless. We're just throwing things out there, and it's not going to make an impact. You need a minimum viable amount of folks to actually engage with something to create cultural change management, right? So I'd say that time is the biggest blocker to thoughtfulness, and thoughtfulness is really required to grow and sustain empathy and respect and care. So, in terms of what companies can be doing, I think, first off, to that point, provide enough time and patience and give people the space to actually engage with all of the things that we want to do around this work, but even just engage with each other. I mean, it's just so important. Like, if you and I, Joseph, were about to go work on a project together, we didn't know each other well. I have no idea how you prefer to work. I have no idea like what communication norms work best with you, right? Let alone know about like the kinds of like trauma or experiences or skills and expertise that you bring to the table. I need to take some time to get to know you to then work as effectively as we can, right? So provide time and space is number one. Number two is amplify, 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 right? When companies can find your customers and your employees who are willing to tell their stories and highlight them, that can create such an impact. Make the connection between their experiences and their stories and what you do as a business wherever possible, and let the community speak for itself, right? That's a really authentic way to show up in this space, is by actually amplifying the voices in question rather than trying to speak for them. Third, I say, is do the meaningful work, right? Back up your words with action. This is so obvious, but take advantage of moments that you can show up like in that moment specifically to kind of highlight the rights and justice for those people. And this can sometimes be a risk for a company, but a company's courage in the face of that risk is what is truly meaningful. And it's very often, more often than not, extremely rewarded by your customers, right? And then finally, I'd say integrating the core values of respect, empathy, and courage into the expectations within the workplace, right? So how you're training people around how you expect them to engage, what you're considering to be professional behavior, very importantly, what are you rewarding? What behaviors are you rewarding in the workplace? And hold people accountable to inclusive engagement, inclusive leadership, and equitable principles in all that they do day to day. All the way from, product design and services to marketing to employee experience and beyond, throughout the entire business lifecycle of what you do. If you really truly value those principles and hold people accountable to it, then all of the good things kind of come along with that.
Thank you for unselfishly sharing I would say 4 gold bars, because literally those are really very important, and I think really truly actionable when it comes to how companies can eventually embrace and start practicing and bring to life the real concept of DEIB. But I'll poke some challenges on that, especially when it comes to public companies or the exec team we're in. Okay, profitability is important, revenue is important. We need to report to our shareholders and stakeholders that stock prices will always be up. And you're telling me time, getting to know each other, and all those very existentially helpful and healthy tips will bring all those to us? Justify that to me, Kristy. Convince me that it will affect our bottom line positively.
Yep. Well, I think part of my job is a little bit easier around this these days because there's so much external research being published more recently around the very clear impacts on a business's bottom line through things like focusing on inclusion and belonging. And again, it just, when I talk to leaders, I just have to make it so simple. Of course, when people get along well and know how to collaborate well, they're going to create better products. They're going to work faster. They're going to work better. Oftentimes, I think we shy away from, we build a great diverse team, for example, and there's a little bit of that storming, right? Like there's even all these frameworks around storming, forming, performing, right? Like the different cycles of how teams kind of come together. And it's funny because I think in the business world, we think about that and we apply that as a general standard, but then we don't apply that to a standard around DEIB, but it's the same thing, right? So you have a great diverse team come together. They're going to take a little time. There's going to be a little bit of headbutting sometimes. There's going to be a little bit of moments here and there where they're storming, right? They're figuring out how to engage best with each other. But once they do that, there are so many facts and figures that I have in all of my decks and all of my paperwork that I use all the time that shows that once they get past that point of truly understanding how to work well together, they are outperforming all of the other teams in innovation, in effectiveness, and in driving revenue. I have this view of all the different positive impacts for a company across every possible stakeholder, from employees to customers to like financial stakeholders or investors to leaders, and importantly also just to the broader community, right? And I have facts and figures that kind of prove out the value in all of those. There's lots of data that points to how customers truly reward companies that are showing up in this space and that show that they care about the community. And then, when we talk about community, don't forget that in the near future, there is not going to be any single demographic group that is a majority in the US, right? So if you're looking to create a resiliency in your company, speaking to the very, very diverse group of customers and potential talent, and doing that now and building that infrastructure now and building that perspective of your company, that brand recognition for your company now, is going to help set you up for success, not just now, but in the further future, right? So I totally understand that it's difficult to ask for that level of patience when it comes to the output around this work, but there are a lot of different ways to look at how we measure success in this space. And some of those things are going to give us more like shorter term wins that we can point to, and some of them are going to take a little bit longer and be longer term wins. But there are data points and metrics across the entire employee lifecycle. So if all that external data doesn't make the case, look at your internal data, right? There's all kinds of metrics across that employee lifecycle. Everything from recruitment data by demographic groups, representation data, hiring, terminations, promotions, performance scores, employee feedback and surveys, focus groups, pay parity. I mean, exit surveys. But the point is I think we need to create the appetite for that data, because we say we want it, but then we don't actually use what we have, right? And if we create the appetite and the conversations around the data, then this becomes a moot conversation or a moot point, right? And then I just want to point out, though, that we talk a lot about how this work affects a business's bottom line and helps a business do better. That's great. It's also about the people, though, right? I have to remind people that people do the work. I don't care what technology you have. There's somebody behind something pressing a button, right? People are customers. People are our families. People are our communities. So in the end, the most important thing is enabling people. And the most important measure of success is what those people are telling us, right? What better way to measure the success of things like inclusion and belonging than simply asking, do you feel included and as if you belong, right? So that was a very long-winded answer to say, Joseph, that I just think that like companies need to be a little bit more self-reflective, both on what they're seeing externally and all that available data that speaks to that bottom line impact, but also very importantly, internally, really taking a close look at their demographic data and their employee sentiment data and seeing what stories are coming out of that.
That's great advice, Kristy. I'd have to say that, there are literally proof points. You're right. I think, at this day and age where data is so democratized, best practice results are actually published as well. Having those proof points available and using that as a way to, influence, convince, and drive impact for change of behavior and eventually influencing action is actually going to be very, very helpful. So thank you for that great advice. Question though, for folks who are working in, should we say, smaller organizations or startups that have not really fully established yet the concept of DEIB, for example, or they probably don't have ERGs, or this might probably just fall under HR or internal communications. What would be your suggestion for folks who are listening to us, who are very much influenced by the idea that I want to bring this to my organization, I want to bring this to my company, I want to introduce the concept of DEIB? Where do I start and how do we start?
Yep. So I actually published an article about how small businesses can get started with DEIB, and I'd love to post that link for everyone, because it's something that's top of mind considering I work at a company that empowers entrepreneurs, right? So I actually do some trainings around this, and there's a little bit more detail in there. I also would love to actually share some of those external metrics that we were just chatting about, Joseph, because I didn't want to rattle them off, but I want to arm people with great data, right? So I'll give you all those sources that I use as well, and I'll link them here. So I think there are a couple of ways to think about this, and it might be a little bit different if you're a small business owner or an entrepreneur starting out and you're designing, your workplace and your customer experience versus you're coming into an existing workplace and experience. Two slightly different lenses. But I'll start with small business. First, I want to say it's a perfect time. It's a perfect time to think about how you're integrating these priorities into your day to day. If you design the way that you operate, like while prioritizing equity, then it is going to be built into the fabric of how you run from here on out. And that is how to make a real impact. So my advice to folks who are starting out and kind of, building and designing their own businesses, I'd say be reflective. Consistently ask yourself to step back and consider the end to end of whatever it is that you're looking at, whether it's how I'm designing a product or how I'm designing a service or how I'm marketing something to my local customers, how I'm opening up, a brick and mortar store. Just take a step back and think about that process and say, okay, where are there places through this process that different people might experience the thing differently? And then how am I accounting for them? So I think in the article that I published, I give the example of product design, right? Like, let's say you're coming up with some sort of product. There's just a standard cycle that you go through from like ideation to design to testing to then production, right? Whatever it is, there's some semblance of that kind of end-to-end cycle. And that's true of every process that we do. I mean, even when we get up and like get ready for work, right? There's a process. We get up, we walk to the bathroom, we brush our teeth, there are processes. Everything is kind of a process. So I think my recommendation generally is to really just take that step back and consider, all right, if I was somebody of a different race or a different ethnicity, if I had a specific kind of disability, if I was LGBTQA+, what in this process or what in this experience might be felt differently by those folks? I'm not saying that you're going to understand and know, right? But it's just that thoughtfulness, those little yellow flags that go off where you might be thinking, I'm opening up this brick and mortar store and, I have like the minimum accessibility standards in place, but I haven't really thought about like, above and beyond that. And what if somebody has this sort of disability instead of that sort of disability? Maybe I'll just model this a little bit differently or just, set this up a little bit differently to allow for that. So that's my first suggestion. Second suggestion is involve people from all of these different groups to give you feedback, right? It's essentially just user testing. Just do that more consistently and throughout. None of us can represent all of these different experiences. So like, let's go to the source and like ask those folks, right? Like, oh, hey, I'm designing this new, massage service, right? And this is the way that I'm thinking about setting up the payment around it and the fees. Like, is there anything I'm not thinking of, right? Like, find different communities and different resources that you can tap, and that might be directly in your network, or it might be doing research or connecting with organizations, online. And then for folks who are coming into an organization that currently exists, a couple of things there. I'd say first, be persistent, right? Working to create change never ends. So we may make some progress, but there's always a risk of backslide, or, you might get a lot of no's or a lot of, misunderstandings or whatnot in the get-go. So being persistent in some way, kindly persistent, is important in this work. Be pragmatic, right? I think we talked a little bit about realism before, and that I'm a Scorpio, so I have a tendency to be very focused on like realistic outcomes. Unfortunately, I think the only way to truly build like a fully just and equitable society would be to like totally undo all of our existing systems, right? And like, because all of our systems were essentially built on some injustice and privilege, right? So like, that's not a realistic goal to have. We're not going to you can't go into a workplace and say, I'm going to totally undo everything that we do here today and rebuild it in a way that's more just and equitable. So be pragmatic about the change that you can see and that you can work toward, and do your best to focus on that, because those small bits of change really can create a macro impact. And then finally, be creative and flexible. There often aren't clear and easy answers in this work. And again, you might be facing a lot of resistance because, for whatever, there's many different reasons. And we're talking about really complex things around identity and relationships and society, right? So we often have to be very creative in our approaches and solutions and extremely flexible. If you can't get this thing done, fine, I'll find another way, or I'll go and work on this now instead. As a DEIB professional, I constantly have a backlog of all of these different things that we can be doing, right? And I'm always pulling, this is kind of stalled over here, or this is going to take some time, so let me take that and start working on that. And it's really about, I describe it as like planting seeds all across the organization. Plant that seed, I plant that seed, I'm watering that one over there, right? I'm replanting that one over there. So that level of flexibility is helpful. And be flexible with yourself too, because there are times when you might need to step back and step away because it's hard. And we can't help others if we're not taking care of ourselves first. And then just for both scenarios, small business owner or, coming into a business, model allyship for all, right? Examine your own biases, educate yourself on communities you don't know as much about, generally model the behaviors that you are looking to see in others in all circumstances. And honestly, we make the biggest impact through doing, which puts positive peer pressure on each other, to do the same.
This is a webinar, I would have to say. Thank you so much for literally unselfishly sharing all those steps and scenarios, because, we can literally apply them. I know it's such a lofty goal, but how practical and tangible and specific the steps that you've recommended, I'm sure that folks who are really serious about taking this on and taking this forward, whether they're startup solopreneurs or those who would want to have their organization embrace DEIB, they can definitely apply that continuously. The thing that kind of struck me with your answer is towards the end when you said you need to take a step back sometimes, especially if you're a DEIB professional. You're empowering everyone and trying to solve challenges in the world that will be never ending. It's not a black or white. It's not a point A and point B and then we're done and dusted. It's like in marketing, we create a campaign and then we see the result. Okay, well, let's move on to the next campaign because it's done, right? This is an ever evolving, ever changing situation that we don't know how things will eventually end, especially in the challenges that we are facing in the world where we're living right now. So my question to you is, as a DEIB professional, how do you keep motivated and inspired to drive this mission and to drive this change through education and advocacy that you're starting to build? And for younger folks who would be, considering future careers, why should they also be interested in DEIB work, and why should they sign up for this amazing career path that is truly meaningful?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I will say, like, in the DEIB professional community, we're constantly talking about this, right? Like, we often ask each other, how are you taking care of yourself? What are you doing for your self-care? Look, I won't lie. The work is hard. Caring is hard. You can be feeling this weight on your shoulders, day to day. And using so much of myself for education can often be hard. And that's something that I know we talked about, the organization that you and I, well, you continue to work at, the nonprofit Speak Out, right? It's like sharing our stories and using ourselves for education is so difficult. And sometimes it's harder than other times, right? And I don't judge anyone for not wanting to focus on this work, like considering the toll it can take on mental health and just like, the resilience that it takes, and none of us are immune to any of this, right? So like first suggestion is like really truly think about it and be flexible again with yourself on, I might be interested in it now, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be interested in it in the future, right? Or vice versa. I'm not interested in it right now, but maybe I'll be interested in the future. For me personally, though, it's funny because I don't know. I don't know what the alternative would be. It's kind of ingrained in who I am. Here's an example actually around that. So one time I was watching TV with my mom, right? And some random commercial came on. That was just a regular, day-to-day commercial. I spent the next 5 to 10 minutes like raging about all of the injustices and the inequities and the problematic things that I saw in that like little 30-second commercial to her. And I remember like it went silent, like I like did my raging and then I stopped and it was just silent. And I was surprised. I looked up and she was just looking at me and she just goes, does that ever stop? Does that ever turn off for you? I was just like, no, Mom, it doesn't. I don't know what to do. It doesn't. It really just doesn't. Right. So I think I could have either tried to kind of lock that down a little because it is a lot, or I could have leaned into it, and I chose the leaning into it, right? Because I felt like, hey, if I'm seeing these things already and if I'm kind of hyper focused on it just in my personal life, why not do something about that? And when the opportunity came up to actually take my background and really fully apply it to this work, I was like, I feel like I've been working toward this, like without even necessarily knowing it, right? I feel like I've always looked at ways to make change through my career. That's why I got into education off the bat, because I felt like education is the one thing that can change the world, right? So I wanted to stay in education in some way. That's why I got into what was academic publishing at the time. And this work didn't really exist as formally then, right? But then as I started getting more and more into this work, somewhat accidentally, somewhat by design, it was a very clear path to kind of combine that personal passion that I have and just that innate kind of focus that I have with my desires to make change. When I wake up every morning, I like to know that I'm going to go. Look, it's not fun to sit in the chair for 9 or 10 hours and type at a computer all day. It's not, I don't think any of us really prefer to be doing that with our time. I know that I'm personally always looking forward to retirement, right? But at the same time, the thing that helps me get up is knowing that at least if I'm going to be doing that, at least if I'm going to be working day to day to day, I'm doing it in a way that might help someone else, even if it's a couple of folks out there, right? If I can make the workplace a little bit more inclusive for 1 or 2 people, right? Then that feels to me personally, that's what inspires me. So yeah, I think what drives me is that combination of just who I am and like my internal the way that I just operate. It's so ingrained in who I am, and then combined with my general penchant for caring about respect and justice and equity. I was very lucky in finding a way to bring those things together. And for those who don't have that opportunity to make this a day job, do what Joseph and I have done, which is also volunteer in the nonprofit, right? There's all different ways that you can dedicate your time and energy into things that matter to you. And in this day and age, too, there are a lot of different ways to do that, even fully online. You can volunteer for an organization that's global or outside the country or, anything that is meaningful to you. Think about where your passions lie. And I guarantee you 99.9% of the time, there's going to be some sort of opportunity for you to lean into that passion and to do something that will make you feel good. And, I think there's even research that shows that like when we do good things for each other, we physically feel better. We literally are physically healthier because we are humans. We live in communities and societies, and the part of that is meaningful to us and that gives back to us is this sense of community, right? And to do that, we have to be kind and empathetic, and it's helpful to make change in each other's lives because it makes us feel better and feel good.
Thank you for that, Kristy. And thank you for sharing that anecdote about the TV commercial, because that's, when you share that story, I was like, you're really literally wired, like, because this is your 9 to 5, but like, how your mom reacted, 9 to 5 never stops. Because I think it's kind of I view it as like a blessing and a curse, because what you do is who you are and you apply that in your 9 to 5. And, it's quite fortunate for you to find that, because, going back to the saying, like, find what you love as your work and you're not going to work every single day of your life, which I think you're living. And it's beautiful because it's something that people are always aspiring to have. But I also love your advice wherein if we can't find that in our workplace, finding ways or avenues or compartmentalizing your life, because there are ways for sure for you to be able to practice that passion and bring that out and share that to the world, because our lives wouldn't end from that 9 to 5. So thank you for sharing all those great stories and those great examples and advice, which brings me to my last question now that I also ask all my guests, because you've mentioned about the importance of what we are doing that's meaningful and purposeful, that brings us that actual physical health and wellness. And also there's a research that says that if you do something meaningful and for others, you're actually internally happier. So my question to you is, what does a meaningful life mean to you, and how do you live that every single day of your life, Kristy?
I don't know that I've ever actually thought about that. So I appreciate you making me, because it's an interesting question. I think a meaningful life to me is whatever brings someone joy, happiness, and peace. Honestly, whatever that is. And that's the definition of meaningful is going to be different to all of us. That comes with a caveat, which is without harming others, right? So it has to be meaningful without harming any others, and better yet, maybe even helping others. But I think generally speaking, like, we put so much pressure on ourselves to like do all these big and great things in our lives. But to be honest, like, I don't know if that's what's meaningful. What's meaningful is just finding your joy and your happiness and your peace, whatever that looks like. If that means going to live in the woods in a cottage with a cat, which I sometimes dream about, great. That's meaningful for you, right? If it means dedicating your life to a nonprofit, great. That's what's meaningful to you. If it means working a 9 to 5, coming home and going all in with your family and like not caring about that 9 to 5 at all, great. That's meaningful to you, right? So I think to me, meaningful is really going to be a very personal definition. I encourage everyone to take a really like odd perspective on that. Don't limit yourself to what society is telling you is meaningful, because it can and does look different for all of us. And I think that's honestly the beauty of our diversity, right? And to me, I will say, like, I don't know, a meaningful life for me is really, I I have to say, I love the boring days, Joseph. The boring days are the best. The world is chaotic and there's always so much going on. So I find the most meaning on the days when I look back and go, nothing really happened today. And that was beautiful and lovely. And like that's when I feel that sense of joy and happiness. It's not to say good things can't come from chaos, right? But I think I can rest and relax the most on those days when I realize, today could have been a lot worse. And it has been, and it wasn't today, and that's lovely. And those, I try to live in those moments. That's meaningful life for me is also just those moments of joy, happiness, and peace.
Love that. Kristy, thank you so much for unselfishly sharing a lot. I know you. We've chatted a lot about all these topics before, but I have a lot of new takeaways. So thank you so much for, making us learn or sharing all those beautiful experiences. But I'm sure a lot of our listeners or your viewers would want to find out more. I'll definitely link on the show notes all your articles or all the resources that you have unselfishly shared. But for folks who would want to reach out to you directly, you can share your platform or your contact details. The floor is yours.
Oh, 100%. And to be honest, like, again, my story is no more important than anyone else's, right? And I love to hear from others and learn from others. And a lot of this work is just about us brainstorming together, like how to support each other. That really is how we do, DEIB work and how we support the LGBTQA plus community in particular. Please, everyone, I'm happy for you to reach out. I'm one of the only people you'll probably ever meet who has no social media outside of LinkedIn. So you can just look me up, Kristy Lilas on LinkedIn. And please connect with me there and share any resources or stories that you have as well. And honestly, feedback too. If there's anything I said that you're like, I would have done this a different way, or, please share that with me as well. And thank you again, Joseph, just for doing this work, right? Like some of the best practices I mentioned were amplifying and, allowing people to use their voices, and you're doing all that.
And thank you so much as well, Kristy. Continue what you're doing and continue bringing more meaning to the world. Really appreciate this conversation.